Indie answers question 6. Timelines, does your book need them? So when I say timelines, I'm not talking about any sci-fi shit like what I'm sure you are assuming I mean by timelines as in having multiple timelines in the book or something. I'm not referencing that. What I'm referencing is in when I ask the question, do you need a timeline? Is do you need a timeline of events? So say for instance in most stories there's a clear Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, right? So Act 1 sets up the characters, Act 2 gives them an event to conquer, Act 3 is the closure. What I'm saying, answering in this episode, is do I think most, if not all, books need to be more detailed in how their timelines are than just Act 1, Act 2, Act 3? So the short answer to this is, in most instances, yeah, you do need a timeline. The long answer is, it really depends what you're trying to do. I'd say 90% of the time, if you're writing any kind of story, even if it's non-linear, or even if it's linear, sorry, like it follows a very simple step-by-step process, it still needs to have the step-by-step of what happens in the story. And you still need to know when certain events take place, at what time, what the time of day is, what season it is. You still need to know all of that. And the best way, I think, to piece all that together is to have a timeline. Because I've written without a timeline before, and it's not fun. It's not easy at all when you're trying to write something and describe a place and then you realize, oh wait, I haven't described what season it's supposed to be, or what time of day it's supposed to be, or the time of day for this doesn't match up with the time of day of the previous scene. Like, for example, time gaps. Like, there's just unintentionally a gap of time where chapter 10 happens in the morning or something, and then chapter 11 happens like in the dead of night, and you don't account for what happened between then. You don't explain it away with any exposition or anything. You just go, it's just night now. There's lost time in these characters' brains and in this story's hive that you just can't account for. Like, what did they do? Maybe nothing interesting. Maybe they were just sitting around. In which case, you should probably describe that they were just sitting around. You shouldn't just assume the audience knows that, because for as far as the audience is aware, they may have been fighting dragons or something, and you just told them, well, it's evening now. Nothing happened of note. Trust me. But like, it just comes back to this whole thing that I think a few of my English teachers have told me over the years when I was still in school, is that you need to treat your reader like they're an idiot. Treat them like they need to have absolutely everything explained to them. Well, not absolutely everything. There's show and don't tell, obviously, but the whole concept of you need to explain to them what happened at this time of day, what they did, etc., and what they did in the in between times. You could even make it very simple by being like, well, I I woke up from a nap. Like, even if you just mention that they had a nap, it's like, well, okay, that makes sense. It's a very easy way of explaining how time's gone away. Or just explain like, oh, he or she or they, whatever your character's pronouns are, just decided to watch TV in that time. If it's in the modern world, or if it's not in the modern world, they decided to read. They decided to go on a wander around, but it's not necessarily that interesting for you to know where they wandered around to, or they had a conversation with a character, but you don't want the audience to know that character yet, or you don't want the audience to know what the conversation was about yet, in which case you can do fun little foreshadowing where it's like, you spoke to this character, what to speak about? You don't know. Turns out that character was the villain the whole time. And the main character knew this, but you didn't because weren't privy to this conversation. So what I like to do with timelines is I like to, before I even pick up the book most of the time, or before I even open up a Word document and start typing into it, I like to write down a chronological order of events, like a little map like this, and go, well, this is where the story starts. on this date. This is where it ends on this date. All the stuff in between happens. You can make up what happens in between as you go. You don't have to. You don't have to be as much of a plotter about it as I have been in the past, where you're just like, this happens this hour, this happens this hour, this happens this hour. You don't have to go that far. But what I would say you should do is you should go at least far enough that you know that there aren't any unexplainable time gaps or unexplainable plot holes that happen due to time being lagged, unless it's intentional, like what I mentioned before, like like you didn't want to the not the protagonist, you didn't want the readers to know about that conversation, or if you're trying to mess with the timeline with the chronology in such a way that makes it seem like the protagonist is losing time because maybe they have a condition that means that they do lose time, but you don't want to, and you don't necessarily want to make it obvious. In that case, I'd say you should still probably have a timeline. You just don't need to let the audience know that it's that it exists until the last possible second. But anyway, I was getting a bit off topic there, sorry. What I'd like to say is that, especially for books that take place over a shorter period of time and are a lot more. Sorry, I'm still recovering from something. That's why there wasn't an episode last week. Yeah, that's the only reason I wouldn't do an episode, is because I'm either ill or not around. By not around, I mean on holiday, not dead, but also that. But, where was I? Yeah, so for what I was going to say was that for books that take place over, say, a week, and everything's resolved in a week, you should definitely have a very detailed timeline of events. You should definitely have what happens in to each character or each main character on each day. It doesn't have to be it doesn't have to be anything big. It can be very simple if you want it to be. You could simply write something along the lines of, well, what I had in Sapphire Sunlight, for example, because that book took place over the course of a week. So that whole book, I think, took place over 8 days total, but only about the first day was just the introduction day, and then most of the plot relevant stuff only happened in about a week. And for one of them, I even had like something. It wasn't necessarily day four, but for example, I had it say day four. Octavia speaks to Oscar. It's just like about Bloodworks. It's that. That's it. It's very simple. It doesn't need to be anything that anyone else needs to understand. It just needs to be something that when you read it, you go, "Oh yeah, I'm supposed to do this." However, what I will say is that you don't need to be restricted by the timeline, and you don't need to necessarily have one, especially if the story takes place over a very long period of time. Like, say, there's a lot of time skips. You don't necessarily need to describe everything that happened in the time skips. If, say, it's a year, you just need to mention the passing of time or make it obvious that there was a passing of time. For example, you need to mention, like, maybe a character has a different haircut. Maybe they did what I did over the course of the past 2 years, which is growing my hair out. So if you watch Indie Opinions, season 2, episode 1, my hair's really short, and now it's this length, longer than this even, because you can't really see it behind the headset. But you need to show that there was a passage of time. You can't just plop in a thing that says 2 years later, like a page that just says 2 years later, and then not explain anything that happened in between that time. I mean, you can, but it's bad writing. And it makes the reader disinterested. Because it makes them less interested in the characters that they were now. They're more interested in what the characters did before, or in the in-between. Especially if a character goes through a big change, like becoming, let's say, if they become an asshole over that period of time. You'd kind of want to know about that, or why they did that, to justify that character being that way, or to not justify it if it's for an unjustifiable reason. But you need to give them the reasoning for it. So timelines, in general, I'd say you need them as much as is humanly possible. But this is very much in this current my current state. This is very much a do as I say, not as I do. Because at the moment, for Emerald Executioner, the final book in the SO trilogy that I'm working on, and also the final book in Roadshed Universe Part 1 before I decide to try and get traditionally published again. Again, as in try again, not as in I've been traditionally published before, is I don't really have a set timeline. And I'm noticing in my edits actually that it's actually kind of biting me in the ass because I keep looking at it and going, wait, so Sarah was doing this in the morning and now it's from Octavia's perspective, but it's in the evening. What the fuck did either of them do in the in between? So I've been having to add quite a bit of exposition, let's say, and or whole new chapters to fill in the blanks. Not filler chapters, they're still relevant to the story, but just whole new chapters of things that I didn't add in the rough draft. Or even when I was rewriting it, the second draft necessarily, because I'm up to the editing stage of that, that I didn't realize was in there, wasn't in there, that needed to be. So yeah, that's just my thoughts on whether or not your book needs a timeline. Short answer, probably yeah. If you want, if you want to have it be consistent and avoid plot holes as much as possible, I'd personally recommend it. Of course, you don't necessarily have to, especially if you're trying to mess with the reader's minds by doing it backwards or by telling a story from one avenue in time, but and then recalling the past, but you don't know it's recalling the past. Like the book The Silent Patient. If you haven't read it, I'd recommend reading it. Sorry, I kind of spoiled it then, but yeah, that's just my opinion on this and my answer to the question: timelines. Does your book need them? Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. If you have any ideas for future questions you want me to answer, please let me know. And I'll see you next week. And as always, write on.